Most test takers treat logical reasoning like a deck of flashcards. Flaw means look for X, assumption means look for Y. And on paper, that feels productive. But in practice, it's like labeling every thread on a tangled ball of yarn without ever tugging on the knot itself. Now, one big reason why that approach stalls your score is that question type labels sit on the surface. The core is the argument's skeleton: cause and effect links, conditional chains, comparisons, sampling errors, and if you only memorize the label, you never touch the bones. The second big issue is decision fatigue. The second you identify a question as strengthened, your brain flips to a canned checklist, like look for new evidence that supports the conclusion. That's great, except strengthened questions come in 10 different flavors. Some fix causal gaps, others patch statistical holes, and still others add in missing definitions. And if you don't see which type you're facing, the checklist turns into noise, and you waste time scanning answers that feel supportive but don't address the real flaw. The third issue is what I call hidden pattern blindness. Under pressure, the LSAT reuses a small set of reasoning patterns again and again. For example, an argument that jumps from a correlation to a causal claim. And that structure shows up in strengthen, weaken, flaw, and even parallel reasoning questions. If you can spot the pattern instantly, you're 4 questions ahead of the curve. If you're label locked, you've got to relearn the pattern every single time. Now, the fourth big issue is misplaced confidence. Flashcard-based prep rewards recognition, not application. You nod along with it. Yep, necessary versus sufficient, got it. But then test day hits, and the argument blends a conditional chain with a percentage trap, and suddenly your memorized definition can't save you, so you either freeze or you end up guessing. So a better approach would be argument-first reading, where you look at the stimulus and ask, what claim is being made? On what evidence is it based? You put those two pieces, evidence and conclusion, into your own words, and this 10-second paraphrase forces you to grapple with the real issues at hand. You also want to tag the skeleton. Ask, for example, is the author assuming a causal link? Is it ignoring an alternative explanation? Is it equating numbers with percentages? Write a 1-line note on your scratch paper to build a mental library of recurring moves. Then, before you peek at the answers, make a prediction with a fix or a flaw. Ask yourself, if I had to attack or defend this argument, what would I do? That prediction is going to anchor you when the choices show up with tempting keywords. Only after you've mapped out the argument do you then flip to the question stem. And now the label, weaken, main point, whatever, is icing, not the cake itself. Now, if I had to pinpoint the one moment that changed everything for me on the LSAT, it was the day I stopped asking, what type of question is this? And I started asking, what is actually happening in this argument? And that shift from label-based solving to reasoning-based solving is what took me from a mediocre score in the low 150s to a 175 on test day. And let me explain why this matters. When I first started prepping, I got really good at identifying question types. Like most students, I memorized the signs. If a question stem said assumption required, I knew it was necessary assumption. If it said most strongly supported, it was inference. If it asked what most undermines the argument, it was weaken. And that all helped me feel in control. But there was a problem. I was skipping straight to the stem before I understood the argument. So I was applying techniques before I understood what needed fixing. Now imagine being handed a toolbox and told, go fix the house. You know how to use the hammer, but you never bothered to check whether the problem was a broken pipe or a loose hinge. That's what happens when you lead with question type labels. You're holding a tool, but you're not diagnosing the problem. Now, the turning point for me came when I reversed my process. I stopped reading the question stem first. I stopped looking for keyword clues, and I forced myself to start with the stimulus. Not to memorize it, not to look for matching terms, but to understand it like a real argument. And here's the crazy part. Once I understood the reasoning in the argument, the question stem often became obvious. For example, if the stimulus had a gap in logic, like assuming correlation means causation, I knew it would be a flaw, weaken, or necessary assumption question before even checking the stem. If it was just a list of facts without a conclusion, I knew it was probably an inference type question. If it had parallel conditional reasoning, I could guess it was a parallel question, of course. I didn't need to memorize every question type because I understood the thinking behind the stimulus. The reasoning told me what to expect. Now here's something nobody tells you. Label-first test takers tend to panic when they see a weird question stem. They freeze. They say, wait, I don't know this one. It doesn't fit the script. But if you're focused on reasoning structure, nothing feels unfamiliar. Because the LSAT recycles argument patterns over and over again, it's the surface language that changes. So when I hit a stimulus with a sneaky conditional reversal, an argument relying on a questionable analogy, or a conclusion based on a questionable sample, I didn't care what the question stem said. I knew what the test was trying to do, and that confidence gave me speed. It gave me accuracy, and it gave me a sense of calm that no amount of flashcard drilling ever gave me. So next time you practice logical reasoning, try this process. Start with the stimulus and ask yourself, is there a conclusion? What's the reasoning connecting the evidence to the conclusion? Is there a flaw, a hidden assumption, a missing comparison? Then predict, if I had to evaluate or improve this argument, how would I do it? What you're going to notice is that, over time, you start solving questions before the test finishes asking them. You're not just reacting, you're actively thinking like the test maker. And that's the mindset that gets you to 170 and beyond. Now, one of the most underused strategies on the LSAT is reframing the question in a way that plays to your strengths. Let's say you're solid on flaw questions. You know how to spot a bad analogy, a mistaken cause, or an unwarranted generalization, but you consistently struggle with weakened questions. Here's what most students don't realize. Weakened and flaw questions often test the exact same underlying logic. They just frame the task differently. And once you understand that, you can flip the framing and regain control of the question. Now, here's why reframing works. A flaw question gives you an argument and asks, what's wrong with the reasoning? A weakened question gives you an argument and asks, what new information would make the conclusion less likely? But both assume the stimulus has a problem with the logic. And in both cases, the only way to answer the question is to understand how the evidence fails to justify the conclusion. So, if you already know how to critique reasoning and flaw questions, you can bring that skill into a weakened question by mentally reframing the prompt. So instead of thinking, I've got to find a new fact that weakens this, you think, what's the core issue in the logic? What gap is there? And how could new info shine a spotlight on that gap? It's the same muscle, just a different warm-up. And by the way, this tactic isn't just for flaw and weaken. You can apply it across all kinds of question type categories. Let's say you're good at necessary assumption, but bad at strengthen. You could reframe the strengthen question as, what new info would help confirm the assumption I think the author is making? Or let's say you're strong at parallel, but struggle with must be true. After reading a must be true stimulus, sketch the reasoning structure and ask, what choice copies this pattern back to me? That's going to help narrow your focus. Or let's say you're confident with inference questions, but you're shaky with principle questions. Instead of freezing with abstract phrasing like, which principle justifies the reasoning, treat it like must be true and ask, what principle is already built into the logic of this argument? Now, when you label a question as one you're bad at, your brain starts the problem in a stress-based mindset. And that stress narrows your thinking and reduces your working memory. But if you can flip this question to one that feels familiar, you can reduce that stress. Your brain's going to say, I've done this before. And you're going to return to a problem-solving mindset instead of a guessing mindset. Plus, you're going to shortcut a lot of wasted effort. Instead of spending 60 seconds trying to recall some checklist for strengthening questions, you just go, I know this argument has a flaw. What's the flaw? Okay, now what kind of new information would make that flaw more obvious? You're not jumping between strategies anymore, you're just solving. So if you want to build this skill fast, here's what to do. Pick 5 questions of a type that you're strong in, for example, flaw. Pick 5 from a type that you struggle with, like weaken. And for each stimulus, ignore the question stem at first. Analyze the reasoning. What's the evidence? What's the conclusion? And what's the flaw or assumption? Then, before looking at the real question stem, write down your own. If this were a flaw question, what would I be looking for? Then read the actual question and solve it. What this does is it trains your brain to focus on reasoning first and the labels second. Now, let's be honest. Most LSAT students review their mistakes the same way people skim terms and conditions. Quick, superficial, and totally useless. They miss a question, search an explanation, and read, "The correct answer is C because blah blah blah," nod vaguely, and move on. Then a week later, they make the same mistake on a different question, and they end up with the same score. That's not review. The real gains happen when you stop treating wrong answers like random misfires and start treating them like data. Enter the Socratic review method, a technique I developed after watching thousands of students plateau and realizing they weren't asking themselves the right questions. The first thing you've got to know is that the purpose of review is not to check, it's to diagnose. Most students treat review like, "Oh, I thought it was B, but the answer was C. Got it." But got it means nothing unless you can explain why you chose what you did, why it was wrong, why the right answer felt off, and what to do differently next time. The Socratic review method flips this casual autopilot into a focused post-mortem. Like a surgeon reviewing every cut of the operation, you slow down, rewind your thinking, and examine the mechanics. The first question you've got to ask is, why did I choose the wrong answer? Not because I was rushed. You've got to be specific here. Ask, did it match a keyword in the stimulus? Did it sound familiar or vaguely true? Did it mirror an argument you've seen before? The second question you got to ask is, why didn't I choose the right one? Did it use strange wording? Did I dismiss it too quickly? Did I misread the argument structure? The third question you got to ask is, what trap did I fall for? The LSAT is full of psychological traps. Some answers are designed to encourage you to pick them because they use familiar language, while others are designed to discourage you from picking them because they use weird synonyms or abstract phrasing. Now, the final question to ask is, what rule or insight will stop me from making that same mistake again? This is the magic moment. If you skip this step, you're going to be stuck in review purgatory forever. For example, next time I see a conclusion that says X happened because of Y, I'll ask whether a third variable could explain both. That becomes a reusable mental trigger, a guardrail of sorts. Now, don't just think through these questions, write them out, ideally by hand. And yes, it takes longer, but that's the point. Writing slows down your brain enough to notice its own patterns. You're not just reviewing a question, you are reviewing your thinking process. And over time, you're going to start seeing repeated themes. For example, I tend to fall for percentage to number traps, or I overtrust answers that restate part of the conclusion, or I bail too early on weird sounding but logically valid choices. That pattern map is your personal LSAT blueprint, and it's worth more than any course or textbook. Now, for bonus points, you could actually build a mistake tracker in the form of a simple spreadsheet. And every time you get a question wrong, log the date, the section number and the question number, your chosen answer, the correct answer, the trap you fell for, and your insight or rule to avoid it next time. After 20 or 30 entries, you're going to start to see clusters, your most common blind spots, and the reasoning structures that trick you the most. That's where your study time should go. You're no longer guessing what to drill, you are working from hard data. Now, you might be thinking, this takes way too much time. And yes, it does take a lot of time. But here's what doesn't work. Doing 40 questions a day and reviewing 0 of them properly. Would you rather answer 100 questions and stay stuck at a 160, or answer and analyze 10 of them deeply and learn enough to hit 170? Top scorers don't do more questions, but they get more out of each question. Now let's get one thing straight. Wrong answers on the LSAT aren't randomly wrong. They are strategically wrong. Every wrong answer is crafted by professionals who know exactly how smart people think under pressure. The LSAT isn't just testing logic, it's testing your instincts. And in logical reasoning, those instincts are constantly being manipulated. There's a reason the wrong answer you picked felt right. And that's not an accident, it's a feature. Understanding how these traps work is the first step to escaping them. because once you can spot them, you become immune to them. Now, LSAT answers fall into two big categories of traps. The first are traps of encouragement, the ones designed to pull you in. And these wrong answers feel attractive. They mirror language from the stimulus, and they use phrasing that sounds familiar to align with your natural gut reaction. For example, they might repeat a key phrase from the stimulus, but use it in the wrong way. Or they might say something that sounds common sense in the real world, but isn't logically supported by the stimulus. Or the answer might start off sounding correct, but then suddenly shift into unsupported territory by the end. And the test writers know that under pressure, you're going to latch onto anything that feels similar. That's how they bait the hook. Then on the flip side, you have traps of discouragement designed to push you away. These are correct answers that look wrong on your first glance. They use technical language, abstract phrasing, or unexpected structure. And they sound weird, so you skip them. They might use unfamiliar synonyms that mean the same thing as the stimulus, but not a word that you use very often. Or they might generalize the argument to a logical structure that feels disconnected at first, even though it's exactly right. Or they might use a counterintuitive truth that feels like it contradicts your gut instinct, but is totally supported by the stimulus if only you were to slow down. So if encouragement traps are the candy, discouragement traps are the vegetables. They're good for your score, but your brain instinctively resists them unless you know what to look for. So let's say you're working on a flaw question. You've read the argument, you know the flaw, and you feel ready. Now you get to the choices. You see one that says, assumes that a correlation implies causation. And your brain lights up. You say, yes, I know this flaw, that's got to be it. But wait, that's not actually what the stimulus did. The stimulus didn't claim that two things correlated and then drew a causal connection. It used conditional logic, not a causal leap. You just got hit by a familiar phrasing trap, and you didn't check it against the stimulus. Now, the real correct answer might be something like, fails to consider that the observed outcome could be the result of a third factor not mentioned in the premises. It's less elegant, more wordy, not as sexy, but it's correct. Now, if you've trained yourself to recognize these patterns, you're not going to skip the real answer just because it's dressed differently. So every time you review a question, ask first, what made the wrong answer tempting? Was it reusing language from the stimulus? Did it sound like something I'd say out loud? Was I rushing and I didn't read the second half? Or on the flip side, what made the right answer feel wrong? Was the wording unfamiliar or abstract? Did I misunderstand part of the stimulus? Did I dismiss it too quickly because it wasn't what I expected to see? You're not just studying answers here, you are studying your own cognitive biases. And that's what separates high scorers from everyone else. It's not that they read faster or know more rules, it's that they've trained their instincts not to fall for these tricks. Now, instead of asking, could this be right, flip it. Ask, what's wrong with this answer? Try to prove it wrong before you allow yourself to select it. You're no longer trying to spot what's appealing, you're trying to expose the flaw. And this one mindset shift will immediately slow down your bad guesses and force you to apply logical reasoning to the answers, not just the stimulus. Now let's talk necessary versus sufficient assumptions, because this is one of the most important distinctions in logical reasoning and one that trips up even advanced students. Why? Because the word assumption sounds singular, simple, and universal. So people assume there's only one kind of assumption question, but there are actually two, and they are fundamentally different. Confusing them doesn't just cost you one question, it can break your entire approach to dozens of questions on the test. So let's walk through the difference and how to use it to your advantage. Here is the quick version. A necessary assumption must be true in order for the argument to work. If it is false, the whole thing falls apart. In contrast, a sufficient assumption is something that, if true, would guarantee the conclusion is valid, even if the original argument wasn't airtight to begin with. They're both important, but they're not interchangeable at all. So for necessary assumption, think of the argument as a bridge. The evidence is on one side, the conclusion's on the other, and the necessary assumption is the required plank connecting them. It must be there for you to walk across. Take it away, and the argument collapses into the river. The LSAT tests this by offering an answer that may seem small or unexciting, but if you mentally negate it, the argument no longer makes sense. The negation test is the most powerful tool for necessary assumption. Negate the answer, flip it, and if the argument crumbles, you've found the right one. And this is especially helpful because many wrong answer choices for necessary assumption questions might strengthen the argument, but aren't necessary to its validity. Now let's talk sufficient assumption. Picture the same bridge as before, but this time you've got weak evidence and a shaky connection, and the LSAT is asking you what one idea, if we added it to the mix, would make this entire argument bulletproof. That is a sufficient assumption. It's like injecting truth serum into the gap between evidence and conclusion. Suddenly, the argument makes perfect logical sense. But, and this is critical, sufficient assumption choices are often much stronger than anything stated in the stimulus. They introduce new information. They might sound extreme or unfamiliar, but if they fill in the gap so tightly that the conclusion becomes guaranteed, then they're the right answer. That's why a lot of students miss these questions. They are afraid of strong answer choices. They've been told to be skeptical, but on sufficient assumption questions, strong is good. So how do you know which one you're dealing with? Look at the question stem, the thing below the stimulus. Necessary assumption questions will use words and phrases like depends upon, requires, and assumes. In contrast, sufficient assumption question stems will use words and phrases like allows, enables, and properly inferred if assumed. Now, if you mix these two up, you're going to use the wrong tools. If you apply the negation test to a sufficient assumption question, you're going to waste time and get confused. If you avoid strong language on a sufficient question, you might talk yourself out of the right answer. And if you expect the right answer to guarantee the conclusion on a necessary assumption question, you might reject or eliminate the right one because it doesn't go far enough. In other words, if you don't know what kind of assumption the test is asking about, you're playing the wrong game entirely. So I want you to try out the following drill to train this distinction into your muscle memory. First, take 10 random assumption questions, but don't solve them. Just read the question stems. Label each one as necessary or sufficient based on the wording. Then check your answers based on the key words and phrases in the question stems that I mentioned earlier, and repeat until you can label any stem in 3 seconds or less. When this becomes second nature, your accuracy goes up and your confidence goes up with it. You're no longer going to be guessing at what kind of logic the test wants, you're going to know. Now let's talk about another important distinction. Must be true versus most strongly supported questions, both under the category of inference. And inference questions are often considered easy, especially by prep companies, but ask anyone trying to go from 165 to 170 plus, and they'll tell you these questions are deceptively tricky. Why? Because must be true and most supported questions look almost identical at first glance, but they play by different rules. And most students treat them the same way, and that's exactly why they get tripped up. Both types will give you a set of facts, often without any conclusion, and then ask which of the following can be logically concluded, or which is most supported, or which must be true based on the information above. The language sounds interchangeable. So, what do most students do? They read the stimulus, then try to find the answer that sounds right, but that mindset isn't precise enough and the LSAT knows it. Because the difference between a definitely proven answer and a probably supported answer can be the difference between +1 and -1. Must be true means if the stimulus is true, the answer has to be true. No exceptions, no assumptions, no wiggle room. It's like math. So the right answer to a must be true question is guaranteed by the information in the stimulus. If there is any sliver of doubt that the answer would be false, it's wrong. And this is where most people slip up. They pick an answer that sounds true in real life or feels like a safe bet. But feels true is not the same as logically must be true. Now, in contrast, we have most strongly supported questions, and these are different. They don't require certainty, they just require a certain weight of evidence. So you got to pick the answer that is best backed up by the information given. That's like reading a news article and asking, based on this reporting, what's the most reasonable conclusion I can draw? Maybe the facts don't spell it out exactly, but one answer clearly makes more sense than the others. Here's the key insight. The right answer to a most supported question is not provably true, but just best supported by what you know. That's a subtle shift, but an important one. So why does this distinction matter? Let's take an example. So here's how to approach these questions like a high scorer. For must be true, ask, can I point to exactly where this answer is supported in the stimulus? Is there any possible way this answer could be false? Am I relying on outside knowledge or assumptions? If the answer isn't airtight, don't pick it. Now, for most strongly supported, ask which answer is the most plausible inference from the facts. And even if it's not 100% proven, is it the best supported option in the group? Am I getting tricked by attractive but extreme answers? Now, once students learn that the LSAT sets traps, they start second-guessing everything. And that's good up to a point. But on most strongly supported questions, this kind of hyper-skepticism can backfire. Students will think, wait, I can't prove this beyond a shadow of a doubt, so it must be wrong. Remember that you're not looking for proof all the time. You're looking for support. And strong support is good enough, even if it's not a guarantee. So to master the distinction, try the following drill. Take 10 inference questions, a mix of must be true and most supported, and before solving, label each one based on the stem. Then for each choice, write down, is this definitely true based on the stimulus, or is it just reasonably supported? Then compare your reasoning to the actual answer key, and note where your bar was too high or too low. This forces you to calibrate your truth meter and tune it to what the LSAT is actually looking for. Now let's talk about what weaken really means, because if there's one question type that students love to overcomplicate, it's weaken questions. They hear the word weaken and they imagine they've got to find an answer that completely destroys the argument, like they're supposed to find a hidden nuke in the choices and blow the conclusion to pieces. That mindset leads to one of two things. It leads to wasted time chasing the most extreme sounding choice, or picking a dramatic answer that sounds powerful but has nothing to do with the actual reasoning in the stimulus. Here's the truth. Weaken questions don't ask you to destroy the argument. They ask you to make it less convincing. That's it. Now, weaken really means make the conclusion less likely. In every weaken question, you're given an argument, evidence, and conclusion, and then asked which one of the following, if true, most seriously undermines the reasoning. That doesn't mean the argument has to fall apart completely. It just means you're adding a new piece of information that casts doubt on the connection between the evidence and the conclusion. Think of it like this. If the conclusion was a 9 out of 10 before, your job is to bring it down to a 7 out of 10. You don't need to knock it all the way down to 0. You've just got to shake the foundation. And once you understand this definition, patterns start to emerge. Most correct weaken questions fall into one of these buckets. For example, the first would be alternative cause, where the author says X caused Y, and the answer indicates actually Z might have caused Y instead. This doesn't disprove the conclusion, but it does reduce confidence in the causal claim. Secondly, we have new evidence that undermines the conclusion, where the author assumes something is true without saying it directly, and the answer shows that assumption might not hold. For example, the author assumes a study is representative, and the answer points out a flaw in the sample size. The third would be exposing a hidden comparison or baseline problem, where the author compares two things and assumes they're similar, and the answer points out a key relevant difference or a missing piece of data. For example, let's say they said, Store A saw higher profits than Store B, and a weakener might say, Store A had a massive holiday sale that Store B didn't. The answer is not disproving the conclusion, but they are making it less persuasive. Now, a common trap would be an answer that attacks the topic, but not the logic. For example, if the stimulus said, quote, people who drink green tea live longer, therefore green tea must improve longevity. A bad but tempting answer might say, some people don't like the taste of green tea. That might be true in real life, but it doesn't do anything to weaken the link between green tea and longevity. It's just talking about preferences, not logic. A better weakening answer would suggest that people who drink green tea also tend to exercise more or eat healthier, which would introduce a confounding variable. And that's what the LSAT wants you to spot. Flaws in the logical link, not flaws in the topic itself. On weekend questions, by the way, extreme language and choices is usually a red flag unless the stimulus made an extreme claim. You might see wrong answers that say things like completely disproves or is always false or proves the opposite, and those could of course feel powerful, but they're usually too far removed from the stimulus. You don't need a nuclear option. You just need a well-aimed question mark. The right answer will often feel more like a simple nudge than a knockout punch. So here is a step-by-step process to make your weekend strategy bulletproof. First, paraphrase the argument. ID the conclusion and the key evidence. Then, spot the assumption. Ask what is the author taking for granted to connect the evidence to the conclusion. Then, predict the vulnerability. Ask where is the logic weak? Are they ignoring alternatives? Are they assuming causation? Are they making a comparison without enough information? Then, read the choices slowly. Don't look for what sounds critical, look for what directly attacks the link between evidence and conclusion. Then finally ask, does this make me less confident in the conclusion? Not, does it disprove it? Not, is it true? Just ask, does this shake the logic even a little? If yes, you've found your answer. Now, one powerful way to train weekend skills is to turn the process around. Take 5 flaw questions, and after identifying the flaw, imagine what new piece of information would make the conclusion less likely. Then, write a sentence that would serve as a correct answer on a weekend question. This forces you to think proactively. If I were writing this test, what kind of fact would punch a hole in the logic? And that mindset transfers directly to test day. Now, let's say you've reached the mid to high 160s. You've put in the hours. You know your question types. You've built a decent foundation. At this point, your mistakes feel random and progress feels slow. You're not missing questions because you don't understand them. You're missing questions because the test has leveled up and you haven't adjusted yet. And this is where most students plateau. And it's also where the biggest breakthroughs happen if you shift your focus from surface level skills to reasoning depth. Let me walk you through what that means and how to unlock the next tier of performance. Now, from 150 to 165, you could get by on structure and repetition. You learn the question types, drill the common patterns, eliminate the obviously wrong answers, and master the basics of assumptions, inferences, and flaws. And that works up to a point. But above 165, the test changes. It stops being about whether you know what a flaw is and starts being about whether you can dissect nuanced, layered reasoning at speed. Now, the traps are sneakier, the wrong answers are more reasonable, and the right answers are more abstract. The stimulus doesn't hand you a structure, it hides it behind complexity. In short, the questions don't get harder, they get subtler, and your thinking has to get sharper to match. Now, here is the core idea. At 165 and beyond, question types become less useful as a framework. Instead, you've got to train yourself to recognize reasoning structures, especially when they're designed in unfamiliar wording. These include nested conditionals, where the stimulus links multiple conditional statements together, sometimes with double negatives or abstract phrasing, and they bury the real logic in the middle. You are expected to untangle the chain and find the missing link. You're also going to see causal arguments with hidden alternative explanations. For example, the author will claim A caused B, but the real reasoning flaw is that B might have been caused by something else entirely, or even that B caused A. At 165 plus, the causal claims are not obvious. They're dressed up in real-world language, so you've got to peel that back and ask, what assumptions is the author sneaking in? Third, you're going to see more abstract comparative logic, where the argument compares two things that sound related, but they leave out key information like baseline conditions or definitions. For example, Company X's profits increased more than Company Y's. Therefore, Company X must be better managed. What's missing? Well, were they the same size to start? Did one have a bigger marketing campaign? Are we talking percentages or dollar amounts? And these kinds of logical shortcuts show up constantly at the top of the logical reasoning section. And unless you slow down and translate the comparison into real logic, you're going to miss them. And sometimes the LSAT gives you a totally standard reasoning flaw, like affirming the consequent or circular reasoning, but they wrap it in content you've never seen before. Think environmental policy, philosophy, or abstract political theory. The trick is not to understand the topic, it's to see through it to the structure underneath. Now, let's say your go-to approach is ID the question type, predict the answer, and eliminate based on keywords. That works when the trap answers are badly written, but above 165, all 5 choices might look reasonable. Now they're offering you answers that are technically true, but irrelevant, answers that sound close, but miss a critical word, and answers that use abstract phrasing, but are precisely correct. This is where students say, I narrowed it down to 2, and I picked the wrong one. That's not bad luck, that is a problem of precision. So to fix it, you've got to move from which answer sounds good to which answer mirrors the exact reasoning flaw or structure I identified. That is the next level. So to get beyond 165, you want to use the Socratic review method on everything that you do. Every question you get wrong or have difficulty with, look at where did your instincts go wrong and what did you miss on your first attempt? Translate every stimulus into plain English. If the argument is abstract, force yourself to restate it like you're explaining it to a 10-year-old. Like they're saying X happened because of Y, but they didn't prove other stuff isn't causing X also. This builds your ability to see structure under the complexity. Then finally, track your hardest misses by reasoning pattern. Keep a log of your wrong answers, not by question type, but by reasoning type. Like if you misread a conditional chain, you got thrown off by a weird comparison, or you overlooked a third variable possibility in a causal claim. That's the data that helps you target your practice, not just do more of it. Now, for years, logical reasoning made up only a third of your score, and that was already a big deal. But now, after the removal of logic games, logical reasoning now accounts for 2/3 of your score. That means logical reasoning is no longer just important, it is the core of the test. If you want a 170 plus, this is where you're going to get it. And if you want scholarship money, this is where you earn it. So let's walk through exactly why this shift matters, how the test is evolving because of it, and what you need to do now to stay ahead. So let's keep it simple. Before, you had 3 scored sections, 1 logic games, 1 logical reasoning, 1 reading comp. Now, they replaced logic games with a second scored section of logical reasoning, so now any improvement you make in logical reasoning has double the impact it used to have. Before, a 3-question gain might move your score by only 3 raw score points. Now, that 3-question gain is doubled across 2 sections, so you're getting a 6-point raw score gain. And that is where the leverage lives. The LSAT didn't just double the amount of logical reasoning questions, they've also started evolving the question content. Why? Because they removed logic games, which was a section that tested a lot of conditional logic, formal reasoning, and abstract thinking. They're not just going to leave that skill set behind. They're moving it more into logical reasoning. We are now seeing more formal logic in stimuli. So stimuli are including longer chains of if-then statements with nested or contrapositive logic that was straight out of logic games. We're also seeing more math-adjacent reasoning. So you can expect more arguments involving percentages, proportions, averages, or statistical samples. This is not calculation heavy. You don't need a calculator, but it does involve more numerical reasoning. So for example, a question might say the number of students attending rose by 25%, but the percentage of students passing the test fell. So that distinction would require understanding the difference between percentages and raw numbers, something we've always had in the logical reasoning section, but now we're going to be seeing a lot more of it. We're also seeing more abstract comparisons that test your ability to track relational logic, even if the content feels unfamiliar. Now, most LSAT prep materials haven't caught up yet. They were designed in a world where logic games was part of the picture, so they still emphasize question type memorization, and they underplay advanced logic in logical reasoning, and they treat complex numerical reasoning as being niche or rare. But now, there is a lot more of that content on the exam, and if you don't train for it, you're going to get blindsided. Imagine walking into the LSAT and seeing a stimulus with 3 conditionals and a sum statement embedded within, or a question that hinges on the distinction between average and median, or an abstract flaw where the real issue is 2 things were being compared without a shared baseline. If you've only prepped with old standard drills, those are going to feel like curveballs. But if you've trained your eye to see the structure, you're going to handle them like any other question. So if logical reasoning is now the centerpiece of your score, which it is, it should also be the centerpiece of your study plan. So you want to drill high difficulty logical reasoning questions intentionally. Don't just do questions, categorize them by type of reasoning. Go after hard ones that involve formal logic, multi-step conditional chains, numerical comparisons, and abstract arguments with hidden flaws. You are not just aiming to improve speed, you are training your brain to parse dense reasoning with ease. You also want to blend in the skills that were being tested in logic games. You want to maybe draw diagrams to track conditionals in logical reasoning. You want to write down contrapositives on complex chain reasoning. And you want to make deductions to eliminate bad answers before you even read them. Those old formal logic diagramming strategies are not obsolete. They've just migrated into logical reasoning. You also want to prioritize logical reasoning in your full-length test reviews. You want to spend at least 2/3 of your study time dissecting logical reasoning mistakes. Ask yourself, what made me hesitate? Was this a reasoning pattern that I didn't recognize? Or did the stimulus use a subtle shift in language or numbers that I missed? That's where your score jumps are going to come from. If there's one message I want you to walk away with, it's this. Stop obsessing over the question type and start obsessing over the reasoning. This one shift is the difference between feeling stuck at a 158 and finally cracking a 170. Most LSAT students try to beat the logical reasoning section by memorizing strategies for each question type. They'll say, on flaw questions I do this, on weakened questions I do that. But here's what they don't realize. The same logical pattern can show up in a dozen different question types. If you're solving based on the question type, you're chasing the test. But if you're solving based on the logic, the test starts to feel like it's repeating itself because it is. That's why top scorers eventually stop thinking in categories and start thinking in structures. The LSAT doesn't have an unlimited bag of tricks. It has a finite number of reasoning templates that it reuses over and over again. So whether the question says flaw, strengthen, parallel, or most supported, the underlying logic doesn't change. If you start focusing on how the argument is built, rather than what the question says to do with it, you shortcut the entire process. You'll predict answer choices before even reading them. You'll see through the traps faster, and you'll stop second-guessing yourself every time two choices sound close. And most importantly, you'll build the kind of confidence that shows up under pressure on test day when it counts. And this is why the Socratic review method works so well. When you sit down and unpack what made the wrong answer feel tempting, what made the right answer feel weird, what the real flaw in the reasoning was, and what you personally missed that let it slip past you, you're doing what the LSAT actually tests. Not memory, not tips and tricks, but your ability to recognize, break down, and evaluate arguments in real time. You're training yourself to see patterns that 90% of test takers never even notice. That's what separates a smart test taker from a strategic test taker. And that's the difference between a decent LSAT score and a game-changing one. And the good news is, you don't need to master everything, just what the test rewards. With logical reasoning now counting for 2/3 of your score, you don't need to be perfect everywhere. You just need to be exceptionally clear where the LSAT pays the highest dividends, and that's in the argument core, distinguishing evidence from conclusion, seeing the structure beneath the wording, spotting assumptions before they're named, and disarming traps before they set the hook. If you can do that, you can miss a few crazy hard reading comp questions and still walk away with a 170 plus score. Now, LSAT success is not about tricks or hacks or grinding through 5,000 questions on autopilot. It's about building a sharp, focused, repeatable way of thinking, one that cuts through the language, dissects logic, and ignores distractions. That mindset doesn't just boost your score, it prepares you for law school and prepares you for legal reasoning, and it helps you think more clearly in every area of your life. Start focusing on the logic, and everything else follows.